terrible circumstances, and this is why we all, eventually, understood how impossible it was for her to be truthful. It's supposed to be a happy question, where did you two meet, with a happy answer, opening out to a lifetime of companionship, consequence, and progeny. In our case, lots of progeny. But when that moment dovetails with the very worst event in a young person's life, who wouldn't wish to spare him, and the person innocently asking the question, and, as it happened, our mother herself? The shock, the glare of disapproval, the horror of it all. The bald fact was that our parents met in central New Jersey in a conservative synagogue that looked like a brutalist government building somewhere in the Eastern Bloc. The synagogue was Beth Jacob of Hamilton Township, and the terrible occasion was the funeral of a 19-year-old girl named Mandy Bernstein, who had died 4 days earlier in a car driven by her boyfriend, our father, Sallow Oppenheimer. Mandy was, by every account, a vibrant young person with a glowing white smile and long dark hair, the eldest child and pride of her family, the Bernsteins of Lawrenceville, New Jersey and Newton, Massachusetts, a Cornell sophomore and likely psychology major, and, as far as she herself was concerned, the joyfully intended future life partner of Sallow Oppenheimer. Mandy Bernstein was one of 2 Cornell students who'd perished in the accident, the other being Sallow's friend and fraternity brother Daniel Abraham, a kind boy who was on a first or possibly second date with the other person in the back seat. That person was still hospitalized in Ithaca. Sallow alone had walked away from the wreck. Even then, nobody blamed him. Nobody. Even in those early days, in the grief and rage of the Abraham and Bernstein families and the many friends of the 2 young people who were suddenly, horribly, not there, it was somehow held by all present in the synagogue, and the following week at the E. Bernheim and Sons Funeral Chapel in Newark, New Jersey, where Daniel Abraham would be memorialized, that Sallow Oppenheimer's brand new Laredo had been traveling at an eminently reasonable speed down a perfectly respectable road when it hit a loose rock and, abruptly, incomprehensibly, flipped, landing on its roof, half on and half off the road. It was, in other words, at least in those houses of God, as if the hand of God itself had picked up that vehicle and dropped it back to earth. Who could explain the mystery? Who could make comprehensible the loss? Not Sallow, that was certain. He sat in the second row at his girlfriend's funeral service, 4 stitches in his scalp and an ace bandage, not even a cast, on his left wrist, out of his mind with shock and guilt, barely taking in the stream of Mandy's cousins and high school friends and the contingent of Bernsteins who'd made Aliyah a few years earlier but were now, appallingly, here in Hamilton Township, weeping and looking at him, but still not blaming him. At least to Sallow's face, everyone seemed to be blaming the Jeep. Why the Jeep? Why the Jeep? He'd had his choice of cars, and in fact had been on the point of purchasing a sparkling gray 300D from Mercedes-Benz of Manhattan when his grandmother phoned his mother to say that it was a disgrace for any Jew to drive a Mercedes, and with Sallow so removed from his own Jewishness, from the fact and fate of his own martyred ancestor, Joseph Oppenheimer, Goebbels' own Yud Sus, that he did not understand the company had used concentration camp labor to build armaments and airplane engines? In fact, the answer to that was yes, as Sallow's Jewishness was not particularly acute, either in the religious or, at the age of 19, all that much in the historical sense. Certainly, he was well aware of the mythic Yud Zus, court Jew to the Duke of Württemberg in the 1730s, convicted of a bouquet of fictional crimes when his boss died suddenly, and executed, his corpse hung in a gibbet for 6 years outside of Stuttgart. But that all felt so very 18th century, And Sallow was a young man fresh out of the 1960s, when the entire culture had coalesced around his own generation's youth and vigor and renunciation.